Montana Territory, 1885. Jacob Hartley squinted against the setting sun, a weary sigh escaping his cracked lips as he surveyed what remained of his once thriving cattle ranch. At 25, he'd aged beyond his years, the harsh Montana winters and unforgiving drought-etching lines around his eyes that belonged on a much older man. His ranch, the Double H, had been his father's dream, and now it was slipping through his fingers like the dusty soil beneath his boots. "We lost 3 more head last night, boss," Samuel, his only remaining ranch hand, reported as he dismounted from his horse. "That makes 15 this month alone." Jacob nodded, his jaw tightening as he pulled off his worn Stetson and ran a hand through his thick dark hair. He was handsome in a rugged way, tall and lean with broad shoulders from years of hard labor, his face still youthful despite the burdens he carried. A light stubble shadowed his strong jaw, and his blue eyes held the determined look of a man unwilling to surrender to fate. "The bank's not going to wait much longer," Jacob said, more to himself than to Samuel, 3 months before they take everything. The ranch had been his world since his father died 2 years prior. He'd poured everything into it, his sweat, his blood, his dreams. The Double H wasn't just land and cattle, it was his legacy, the only home he'd ever known. But the frontier didn't care about legacies. Out here, a man survived by his wits and strength alone, or he perished. Love, connection, family, those were luxuries Jacob couldn't afford, not when survival demanded every ounce of his attention. That night, as he sat alone in the small ranch house, studying the account books by lamplight, Jacob faced the truth he'd been avoiding. The Double H was dying. The drought had withered the grazing land, cattle prices had plummeted, and the banknote his father had taken out loomed like a hangman's noose. "I don't need anyone," he whispered to the empty room, a mantra he'd repeated since burying his father. "Just need to keep my head down and work harder. No distractions, no attachments. The frontier doesn't reward the soft-hearted." It was what his father had taught him after his mother passed when Jacob was just a boy. The West was no place for sentiment. Men who let their guards down ended up with nothing but heartache or worse, a bullet in the back. The next morning brought news that would change everything. "There's a cattle auction in Helena next week," Samuel mentioned as they mended fences under the bright Montana sky. "Rumor has it the Army's sending representatives to buy stock for the northern forts." Jacob paused, hammer in mid-swing. "Army contracts pay double." "Triple sometimes," Samuel nodded. "But you need prime stock to catch their eye." Jacob didn't have prime stock, not anymore, but 30 miles north, the wealthy Olson ranch boasted some of the finest cattle in the territory. Old man Olson had been buying up struggling ranches for years, and he'd made an offer on the Double H last spring, an insultingly low one that Jacob had rejected outright. "I'll ride to Olson's tomorrow," Jacob decided. "Maybe he'll sell me a few head I can fatten up before the auction." "He's a hard man to bargain with," Samuel warned. Jacob's expression hardened. "I'm not asking for charity. Just a fair deal." But fair deals were as rare as rain in these parts, and Jacob knew it. Still, the Double H was worth fighting for, even if it meant swallowing his pride. Dawn broke crisp and clear as Jacob saddled his horse and set out for the Olson ranch. The journey took most of the day, the vast Montana landscape unfolding around him, rolling hills giving way to pine forests, then opening to lush valleys that made his own parched land seem even more pitiful by comparison. By late afternoon, he crested a hill overlooking the sprawling Olson property. Whitewashed fences encircled verdant pastures where fat cattle grazed contentedly. The main house stood like a mansion compared to Jacob's modest dwelling, 2 stories with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the sunlight. As Jacob approached, he noticed a slender figure by the corral, working with a spirited chestnut mare. It wasn't until he was almost upon her that he realized it was a woman, and not just any woman. She moved with confidence, her honey blonde hair escaping a loose braid as she guided the horse through its paces. "Whoa there," she commanded, her voice firm but gentle. The mare responded immediately, settling under her touch. Jacob dismounted, leading his horse toward the corral. "Impressive," he called out, causing the young woman to turn toward him. She couldn't have been more than 22, with striking features that stopped Jacob in his tracks. High cheekbones, full lips, and eyes the color of summer sage assessed him coolly. She wore a practical riding dress of deep blue, tailored to allow movement but still feminine in its design. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious as strangers often were in the territory. "I'm looking for Mr. Olson," Jacob replied, suddenly aware of his dust-covered clothes and trail-worn appearance. Jacob Hartley from the Double H Ranch. Recognition flickered in her eyes, the southern spread that wouldn't sell. "That's one way of putting it." A smile tugged at her lips. "I'm Nora Olson." "Gerald Olson is my father." She opened the corral gate and stepped out, extending her hand in a gesture that surprised Jacob. Most women he encountered in town were far more reserved. "He's away on business in Butte. Won't be back for another week." Jacob shook her hand, noting its strength despite its slenderness. "Miss Olson, I was hoping to discuss purchasing a few head of cattle from your father before the Helena auction." "The Army contract," she nodded. "Everyone's talking about it." She studied him for a moment, her gaze more assessing than Jacob found comfortable. "Why don't you come up to the house? You've had a long ride and we can discuss business over supper." Jacob hesitated. He hadn't expected to deal with Olson's daughter, and he certainly hadn't planned on staying. But the sun was already beginning to set, and the prospect of the long ride home in darkness wasn't appealing. "That's generous of you, but—" "But nothing," she interrupted with unexpected authority. "My father left me in charge of ranch operations while he's gone. If you want to discuss cattle, Mr. Hartley, I'm the one you'll be talking to." Something about her confidence, so at odds with his preconceptions, left Jacob momentarily speechless. He'd come prepared to haggle with old man Olson, not negotiate with his beautiful daughter who apparently knew her way around both horses and business. "In that case," he finally managed, "I accept your invitation, Miss Olson." As he followed her toward the house, leading his horse, Jacob couldn't help but notice the way she carried herself, head high, steps purposeful. This was no pampered rancher's daughter, but someone who understood the land and its demands as well as any man. And for the first time in years, Jacob found himself distracted from thoughts of the ranch, his attention drawn instead to the intriguing young woman who had just upended his carefully constructed solitude. Dinner at the Olson home was unlike anything Jacob had experienced in years. The spacious dining room with its polished furniture and proper settings made him acutely aware of his rough appearance, though Nora had graciously given him time to wash up before the meal. "We don't stand on ceremony here," she assured him as the housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, served a hearty stew with freshly baked bread. "Father believes in practical comforts, not Eastern frippery." "Your father built quite a spread," Jacob commented, unable to keep the hint of bitterness from his voice. "He's been fortunate." Nora's eyes flashed. "Fortune had little to do with it, Mr. Hartley. My father came here with nothing but determination and the knowledge he gained working cattle drives from Texas. Everything you see, he built through hard work and foresight." Jacob felt properly chastised. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise." Her expression softened. "No offense taken, I've just grown accustomed to defending our success. Many assume my father's prosperity came at others' expense." "Hasn't it?" The question slipped out before Jacob could stop it. "He's bought out half the struggling ranches in the county. He's offered fair market value to ranchers who couldn't survive on their own," she countered, "including you, if I recall." Jacob set down his fork. "There was nothing fair about that offer." "Perhaps not from your perspective." Nora leaned forward slightly. "But tell me, Mr. Hartley, how is your ranch faring now? Well enough that you're not here seeking my father's cattle to save it." The direct challenge in her words struck Jacob like a physical blow. She was right, of course, which only made it more difficult to swallow. "The Double H has been in my family for 2 generations, he said quietly. "Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you." Something in his tone must have reached her, because Nora's expression changed from challenge to consideration. "I admire loyalty," she said after a moment. "Too few people value it these days." She took a sip of water before continuing. "Now, about those cattle, how many head were you looking to purchase?" They spent the next hour discussing business. To Jacob's surprise, Nora was not only knowledgeable about cattle prices and breeding lines but shrewd in her assessments. She offered him a deal on 10 head, not charity as she emphasized, but a business arrangement that could benefit both ranches if the Army contracts came through. My father always says a rising tide lifts all boats, she explained as they finished their coffee. The territory needs strong ranches, not just one dominant operation swallowing up the rest. Jacob found himself reassessing everything he'd assumed about the Olsons. That's not the philosophy I expected from a man who's made offers on every struggling spread from here to the Bitterroots. Nora laughed, the sound warm and genuine. My father is a businessman first, but he's not the villain some make him out to be. The offers he makes, they're escape routes for those who have already decided to give up, not predatory acquisitions. As the evening wore on, their conversation drifted from business to personal histories. Nora had been educated back east but returned to Montana by choice, preferring the freedom of the frontier to the constraints of city society. She spoke of her mother's death from fever 5 years earlier and how it had strengthened her bond with her father. He taught me everything he knows about ranching, she said proudly. Some of the hands weren't pleased taking direction from a woman at first, but they came around when they saw I could work as hard as any of them. Jacob found himself sharing more than he'd intended, about his father's passing, the struggles of the past 2 years, even his determination to preserve his family's legacy despite mounting odds. It's not just stubbornness, he admitted. The double H is all I have left of them if I lose it. You feel you'll lose them all over again, Nora finished softly. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment Jacob felt something shift between them, an understanding that went beyond words. For the first time in years, someone had seen past his gruff exterior to the truth beneath. The clock chimed 9, breaking the moment and reminding Jacob how late it had grown. I should get back, he said, rising from his chair. Nora looked at him like he'd suggested swimming across a frozen lake. Don't be ridiculous. It's dark and it's a long ride back to your ranch. We have plenty of room here. I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition, it's common sense, she insisted. Besides, you'll want to see the cattle in daylight before finalizing our agreement. He knew she was right, but something about staying under her roof made him uneasy. Not because he distrusted her hospitality, but because her company had made him feel something he'd sworn to avoid, connection. In one evening, Nora Olson had managed to breach defenses he'd spent years constructing. Very well, he conceded. Thank you for your hospitality. As Mrs. Winters showed him to a guest room more comfortable than any place he'd slept in years, Jacob reminded himself firmly of his purpose. He was here for the cattle, for the ranch, for survival, nothing more. Getting entangled with Nora Olson, no matter how intriguing she might be, would only complicate an already desperate situation. The frontier had no place for such distractions. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when everything he'd ever worked for hung in the balance. Yet as he lay in the unfamiliar bed, Jacob found his thoughts returning not to the cattle deal or the impending bank deadline, but to sage-green eyes and a laugh that had somehow made him feel, for the first time in years, that he wasn't fighting alone. Dawn broke with the promise of clear skies as Jacob met Nora at the stables. She traded yesterday's riding dress for practical trousers and a flannel shirt, her hair braided tightly against her head. In the soft morning light, she looked even younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 21 or 22, but her confident demeanor spoke of someone far more experienced. I thought we'd ride out to the north pasture, she said, expertly saddling her mare. That's where we keep the breeding stock you'll be interested in. Jacob nodded, appreciating her no-nonsense approach. Laid the way. The morning passed quickly as they inspected cattle. Nora knew each animal's lineage, pointing out strengths and even acknowledging weaknesses with an honesty Jacob respected. By midday, they'd selected 10 head that would fetch premium prices at the Helena auction if properly presented. They'll need a week of special feeding before the auction, Nora advised as they rested beneath a cottonwood tree, sharing a lunch missus. Winters had packed. Grass-fed is healthier, but grain puts the finish on them that Army buyers look for. I can't afford to keep them here that long, Jacob admitted. The double H can handle the grain feeding. Nora bit into an apple, considering. What if I sent one of our hands to help? Thomas knows exactly how to prepare stock for showing, and he could bring the feed with him. The offer was generous, too generous. I can't accept that. It's not charity, she said, seeming to read his mind. It's investment. If you get the army contract because these cattle show well, my father gets paid in full, plus we establish a relationship with a neighboring ranch that could lead to more business. She smiled. See, pure self-interest. Jacob couldn't help but laugh. You'd make a fine poker player, Miss Olson. I can't tell when you're bluffing. Who says I'm bluffing? Her eyes sparkled with challenge. And please call me Nora. Miss Olson makes me feel like a schoolteacher. Nora, he repeated, surprising himself with how naturally her name came to his lips. Then you must call me Jacob. A comfortable silence settled between them as they finished their meal. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully and a hawk circled lazily overhead. It was a perfect Montana day, the kind that made all the hardships worthwhile. Why do you stay, Nora asked suddenly, when it would be easier to sell? Jacob considered the question seriously. The same reason you came back from the east, I suspect. Some places get into your blood, he gazed across the rolling landscape. My father used to say we don't really own the land, we just borrow it for a while, try to leave it better than we found it. That's a beautiful way to think of it, she said softly. He turned to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. For a moment, neither spoke, and Jacob became acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how the dappled sunlight through the leaves caught golden highlights in her hair. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. One of the Olson ranch hands came galloping toward them, his expression urgent. Miss Nora, he called, reining in his horse, there's trouble at the house. Riders came, 3 of them. They're asking for your father, and they don't look friendly. Nora was on her feet instantly. Did they say who they were? No, ma'am, but Bill recognized one as Tucker Kane. He's been riding with the Delaney gang. Jacob felt a chill. The Delaney gang had been terrorizing ranches across the territory for months, robbery, cattle rustling, even murder when they met resistance. We need to get back, he said, already moving toward his horse. If they're after your father. They won't find him, Nora replied grimly, mounting in one fluid motion, but that might not stop them from tearing the place apart looking for valuables. They rode hard back to the ranch house, Nora leading the way with a recklessness that spoke of her concern. Jacob followed close behind, his mind racing. He had no stake in this fight. The smart move would be to keep his distance, avoid entanglement, but the thought of Nora facing danger alone twisted something inside him. As they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, Jacob could see 3 horses hitched outside the main house. 2 men lounged on the porch while a third paced impatiently. Mrs. Winters and the cook are inside, Nora said tightly. Along with Jenny, one of the maids, most of the hands are out with the herds. Jacob assessed the situation quickly. We need to draw them away from the house. If they're Delaney's men, they're killers. I'm not abandoning my home or my people, Nora stated flatly, her jaw set in determination. I'm not suggesting you do, Jacob replied, but charging in would put everyone at risk. He pointed to a cluster of outbuildings. We can approach from the side, use the barn for cover. Nora nodded and they circled wide, dismounting behind the barn. Through a gap in the wooden slats, they could see the men more clearly now. The pacing figure was lean and wiry, with a scar running down one side of his face. The other 2 were rougher looking, one massive and bearded, the other short with a perpetual sneer. That's Kane, Nora whispered, nodding toward the scarred man. The big one is Delaney himself. Jacob's mouth went dry. William Delaney had a reputation for viciousness that extended far beyond simple robbery. Have they threatened your father before? No, Nora hesitated, but father mentioned problems with men trying to pressure ranchers to sell land near the railroad survey. He refused to be intimidated. As if on cue, Kane's voice carried across the yard. Olson needs to understand this is a limited-time offer. The railroad's coming whether he likes it or not. He can sell to us now for a fair price, or we'll take it when the time comes. Delaney's rumbling laugh followed, and there won't be no negotiating then. Jacob and Nora exchanged glances, understanding dawning between them. This wasn't a random robbery, it was intimidation, meant to frighten Olson into selling land valuable for its proximity to the planned railroad. We need to get help, Jacob said quietly. The marshal in Helena. Helena's 2 days' ride, Nora cut him off. and we don't know what they'll do in the meantime. Her hand moved to the small revolver holstered at her hip, a detail Jacob hadn't noticed before. "You can't shoot your way out of this," he cautioned. "I can handle myself," she replied, then softened slightly at his concerned expression. "But you're right, we need a plan." Before they could formulate one, the front door of the house opened, and Mrs. Winters stepped onto the porch, her posture rigid with fear. "I've told you Mr. Olson won't be back for days," she said. "There's nothing to discuss until then." Kane stepped toward her menacingly. "Then maybe we should wait inside. Make ourselves comfortable." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and Jacob saw Nora tense beside him. "I can't let them hurt her," she whispered fiercely. Jacob made a split-second decision. "Create a distraction at the back of the house. Get Mrs. Winters and the others to safety when they investigate. I'll deal with Delaney." "That's suicide," Nora protested. "I'm not planning to fight them," Jacob assured her. "Just keep them occupied until you're all clear, then we'll both ride for help." She searched his face, conflict evident in her expression. "Why are you doing this? You owe us nothing." The question caught him off guard. Why was he risking himself for the Olson ranch, for people he barely knew? The answer came unbidden, because for the first time in years, someone had treated him as an equal, not an object of pity. Because Nora had shown him kindness without condescension, because something about her made him want to be more than just a man grimly holding onto the past. "Let's just say I'm evening the scales for the cattle deal," he deflected. "Now go, before they decide to take their frustration out on your housekeeper." Reluctantly, Nora nodded and slipped around the corner of the barn toward the rear of the house. Jacob counted to 30, giving her time to get into position, then stepped out into the open yard. "Gentlemen," he called, walking casually toward the house as if he belonged there. "I understand you're looking for Gerald Olson." All three men turned, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. Delaney stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the porch steps. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Jacob kept his own hands visible, maintaining a relaxed posture despite the danger. "Jacob Hartley, Double H Ranch. I have business with Olson." "Hartley," Kane repeated, recognition flickering in his cold eyes. "The stubborn fool from the Southern Valley." "I prefer determined businessman," Jacob replied with a calm he didn't feel. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement at the rear of the house, Nora's distraction working. Delaney snorted. "Business with Olson, huh? What kind of business?" "The private kind," Jacob replied, "but since he's not here, I'll come back another time." He made a show of looking at the three men. "Unless you gentlemen are authorized to negotiate on his behalf." The third man, who had remained silent until now, laughed harshly. "We're negotiating, all right, just not the way he's gonna like." A crash from the back of the house drew their attention. Delaney jerked his head at the smaller man. "Check that out, Eddie." As Eddie disappeared around the corner, Jacob took another step forward. "Sounds like trouble. Maybe I should come back when Olson's actually here." "You ain't going nowhere," Delaney growled, drawing his pistol. "Not until we figure out what you're really doing here." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Jacob needed to keep them distracted longer to give Nora time to get the household staff to safety. "I told you, cattle business." Olson's offering fair prices, unlike some who try to strong-arm their neighbors. He let the implication hang in the air. Kane's scarred face twisted with anger. "You suggesting something, Hartley?" "Just that legitimate businessmen don't need guns to make their point." Jacob allowed his gaze to drop meaningfully to the weapon in Delaney's hand. "Boss," Eddie's shout came from the side of the house. "They're getting away, the women." Everything happened at once. Delaney raised his gun toward Jacob, who dove for cover behind a water trough as the first shot splintered wood near his head. He drew his own revolver, returning fire while scrambling toward the corner of the barn. A second shot kicked up dirt at his feet, and a third tore through his sleeve, grazing his arm. The sharp burn only heightened his focus as he made it to the relative safety of the barn's shadow. Gunfire continued from multiple directions. Jacob risked a glance around the corner and saw Nora crouched behind an overturned cart, exchanging shots with Eddie while Mrs. Winters and another woman ran toward the bunkhouse. Delaney and Kane were advancing on Jacob's position, using the porch columns for cover. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but as long as they were focused on him, Nora and the others had a chance. "You picked the wrong fight, Hartley," Delaney shouted. "This could have been just business." Jacob counted his remaining bullets, 4, not enough to hold off determined killers for long. He needed a new plan. The sound of horses approaching drew everyone's attention. From the north pasture, a group of riders came galloping toward the ranch, Olson hands returning from their work, alerted by the gunfire. There were at least 6 of them, all armed. The odds had suddenly shifted. Kane recognized it immediately. "William, we need to go." Delaney fired one more shot in Jacob's direction before the 3 outlaws broke for their horses. Jacob stepped out, taking careful aim at Delaney's retreating form, but before he could fire, Nora's voice rang out. "Jacob, let them go." He hesitated, then lowered his weapon as the 3 men galloped away from the ranch, dust billowing behind them. The Olson ranch hands thundered into the yard, rifles ready, but the danger had passed. Jacob holstered his gun and moved quickly to where Nora stood, her face flushed with excitement and tension. "Are you hurt?" they both asked simultaneously, then shared a brief, relieved laugh. "Just grazed," Jacob admitted, indicating his bloodied sleeve. Nora's expression shifted to concern. "Come inside." "That needs tending." Within the hour, the ranch had returned to an uneasy normalcy. The hands had been posted as guards, and Mrs. Winters, recovered from her fright, had insisted on preparing a proper meal for the young man who protected us so bravely. Jacob sat at the kitchen table as Nora cleaned and bandaged his wound, her touch gentle but efficient. "It could have been much worse," she said quietly. "Delaney doesn't usually leave witnesses." "They'll be back," Jacob warned. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they won't give up on whatever they're planning." "I know." Nora tied off the bandage and sat back, her expression troubled. "Father needs to be warned, and the marshal and Helena." "I'll ride to Helena tomorrow," Jacob offered. "It's on my way back from delivering the cattle to my ranch anyway." She studied him for a long moment. "You risked your life for us today. Why?" This time Jacob couldn't deflect the question. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. Then, with more difficulty, "And because I couldn't stand by and watch you face danger alone." The admission cost him something, an acknowledgement that he'd broken his own rule about entanglements. But as Nora's hand came to rest lightly on his, he found he didn't regret it. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not many would have stayed." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Jacob felt the careful walls he'd built around himself begin to crumble. This woman, with her courage and intelligence, her kindness and determination, had awakened something he'd thought long buried, the capacity to care about something beyond mere survival. It was terrifying, it was exhilarating, and it complicated everything about his carefully ordered plans for saving the Double H. The next morning dawned with new urgency. Jacob and Thomas, the ranch hand Nora had assigned to help with the cattle, prepared to drive the 10 head back to the Double H. The plan was simple. Get the cattle to Jacob's ranch, then Jacob would continue on to Helena to alert the marshal about Delaney's threats. What Jacob hadn't expected was Nora's announcement at breakfast. "I'm coming with you," she stated, her tone brooking no argument. "At least as far as Helena. Father needs to know what's happened, and I want to speak to the marshal personally." "It's too dangerous," Jacob protested. "Delaney's men could be watching the roads." "All the more reason not to travel alone," she countered. "Besides, 3 guns are better than 1 if we do encounter trouble." Her logic was sound, but Jacob's resistance wasn't entirely rational. Having Nora at the Double H, seeing his struggling operation after the prosperity of her father's ranch, the thought made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't fully articulate. In the end, he relented. They set out mid-morning, the small herd moving at a steady pace, Thomas bringing up the rear while Jacob and Nora rode point. The day was clear and mild, perfect for traveling, and they made good progress. As they rode, conversation flowed more easily than Jacob would have expected. Nora asked thoughtful questions about his ranching methods, offering suggestions that showed her practical knowledge. She spoke of her time back east at school, how she'd scandalized her teachers by insisting on learning subjects usually reserved for male students. "They wanted me to focus on needlepoint and proper etiquette," she said with a laugh. "But I was determined to study business and agriculture. Father supported me completely. He always said a woman's mind was just as valuable as any man's. Your father sounds like an unusual man, Jacob commented. He is, she agreed proudly. Mother's death could have broken him, but instead he channeled his grief into teaching me everything he knew. He said having a purpose saved him. She glanced at Jacob. I think you understand that better than most. He nodded slowly. After my father died, the ranch became everything. As long as I was working to save it, I didn't have to think about being alone. The admission surprised him. He'd never articulated that thought to anyone before. But something about Nora invited confidence, made it feel natural to share burdens he'd carried silently for so long. By late afternoon, they crested the final ridge overlooking the Double H. Jacob felt a familiar mix of pride and worry as he gazed down at his ranch, so much smaller than the Olson spread, the buildings more weathered, the pastures drier. Through Nora's eyes, he imagined it looked pitiful indeed. But when he glanced at her, there was no judgment in her expression, only interest and something that might have been admiration. It's beautiful, she said softly. You can see how much care has gone into it, even with the challenges you've faced. Her words warmed something in Jacob's chest. Not pity, but genuine appreciation for what the Double H represented, years of hard work and determination against mounting odds. It's not much compared to your father's operation, he said as they began the descent. Different, not lesser, she corrected him. Every ranch has its own character, just like the people who run them. At the ranch house, Samuel emerged, surprised to see Jacob accompanied by a woman. Jacob made brief introductions before they set about settling the new cattle in the corral nearest the barn. We'll grain feed them starting tomorrow, Thomas explained to Samuel. By auction time they'll look prime. While the men tended to the cattle, Jacob showed Nora around the main house, a modest structure that had once been filled with family but now echoed with emptiness. He found himself apologizing for its simplicity, then stopped himself, realizing how it must sound. Sorry, he said ruefully. I'm not usually concerned with appearances, but after your father's home. Jacob, Nora interrupted gently. A house doesn't need to be grand to be a home. This place has character. I can feel the history in these walls. She ran her fingers along the mantelpiece where his mother's few treasures still sat, a small china figurine, a tarnished silver frame holding a family portrait taken when Jacob was just a boy. Your mother, Nora asked, studying the photograph. Jacob nodded, moving beside her. She died when I was 12, pneumonia. She had your eyes, Nora observed, kind eyes. Something in her voice made Jacob turn to look at her. Standing there in his family home, examining his past with such genuine interest, Nora seemed to belong in a way that defied logic. They'd known each other barely 2 days, yet he felt a connection that usually took years to develop. The realization was both wonderful and terrifying. Wonderful because it awakened feelings he'd thought himself incapable of experiencing again. Terrifying because it threatened the careful isolation he'd constructed to protect himself from further loss. The moment was interrupted by Samuel calling from outside that supper was ready. The modest meal was nothing compared to the fare at the Olson ranch, but Nora ate with apparent enjoyment, complimenting Samuel's stew with such sincerity that the weathered cowhand actually blushed. As night fell, practical concerns arose. The Double H had only 2 bedrooms, Jacob's and the one that had belonged to his parents, which now stood empty except for essential furniture. You'll take my room, Jacob insisted. I'll bunk with the men. Nora started to protest, but something in his expression must have conveyed that this was a matter of honor for him, and she acquiesced gracefully. Later, as Jacob lay on his bedroll in the bunkhouse, listening to Samuel's soft snoring and Thomas's occasional mutterings, he found himself wide awake, his mind filled with thoughts of Nora. How she'd looked standing in his family home, the way she'd spoken to his ranch hand as an equal, her genuine appreciation for the struggling Double H for the first time in years. He allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where the ranch thrived again, where the house wasn't empty, where laughter and conversation replaced the solitary silence he'd grown accustomed to. It was a dangerous thought. He had no right to such dreams, not when the bank deadline loomed and his entire future remained uncertain. Not when Nora Olson was the daughter of a successful rancher who could offer her security and comfort that Jacob couldn't hope to match. Yet the seed had been planted, and try as he might, Jacob couldn't uproot it from his heart. The following morning brought a change in plans. As they prepared to ride to Helena, a messenger arrived from town with news that the army buyers had moved the auction date forward by a week due to urgent supply needs at the northern forts. The auction's in 3 days, Jacob realized with dismay. The cattle won't be ready. Thomas disagreed. We can do it if we push the feeding schedule. They're good stock to begin with, they just need a bit of polish. Jacob turned to Nora. This changes things. I still need to get to Helena about Delaney, but the cattle need attention if they're going to fetch the prices we need. I could stay, she offered immediately. Help Thomas with the preparations while you ride to Helena. Father won't expect me back for several more days anyway. The suggestion caught Jacob off guard. You do that. Of course, she said as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We made an agreement. The cattle need to be ready, and 3 pairs of hands are better than 2. Jacob searched her face, looking for signs of reluctance or pity, but found only sincere determination. Why? He asked quietly. You barely know me. Nora held his gaze steadily. Because I believe in what you're doing here, fighting for your legacy, refusing to surrender when others would. It matters, Jacob. And I'd like to help if you'll let me. Her words touched something deep within him, a place that had been closed off for too long. This woman who had every advantage, who could have dismissed his struggling ranch as a lost cause, instead saw value in his fight, saw value in him. Thank you, he said simply, the words inadequate for the emotion behind them. Jacob rode out an hour later, headed for Helena with a promise to return as quickly as possible. As he looked back from the ridge above the ranch, he saw Nora already at work with Thomas and Samuel, her golden hair catching the morning sun as she moved confidently among the cattle. The image stayed with him throughout the long ride to Helena, Nora Olson, choosing to help save the Double H when she had no obligation to do so. It contradicted everything he'd come to believe about facing the frontier alone, about the necessity of self-reliance above all else. For the first time in years, Jacob allowed himself to consider that perhaps his father had been wrong. Perhaps the frontier didn't have to be faced in isolation. Perhaps connection wasn't a weakness but a strength, a different kind of courage than the solitary endurance he'd practiced for so long. Helena was bustling with activity when Jacob arrived late that afternoon. The territorial capital had grown substantially in recent years, its streets filled with a mix of rough-hewn miners, businessmen in Eastern suits, and settlers seeking new opportunities. The marshal's office was located near the courthouse, a solid brick building that stood in stark contrast to the wooden structures surrounding it. Marshal James Thornton was a veteran lawman, his weathered face and graying mustache testifying to years of frontier justice. He listened intently as Jacob recounted the confrontation at the Olson ranch, making occasional notes. Delaney's been causing trouble all across the territory, Thornton confirmed. But this is the first I've heard about railroad land grabs. That adds a new dimension. They seemed convinced Olson would sell under pressure, Jacob explained, or that they could just take what they wanted when the time comes, whatever that means. The marshal stroked his mustache thoughtfully. There's been talk of a major railroad spur coming through that could make certain properties very valuable. Sounds like Delaney's working for someone with inside information. He fixed Jacob with a serious look. They'll try again, especially if they think Olson's daughter is alone at the ranch. She's not, Jacob assured him. She's staying at my place until her father returns. Something in his tone must have revealed more than he intended, because Thornton's eyebrows rose slightly. I see, well, that might be safer for now, but Delaney isn't one to give up easily. Will you send deputies to investigate? Jacob asked. I'll do one better, Thornton replied. I'm heading that way myself tomorrow. Been meaning to look into these railroad rumors, and this gives me the perfect excuse. Relief washed over Jacob. Having the marshal involved significantly improved their chances against Delaney's gang. Thank you, Marshal. Don't thank me yet, Thornton cautioned. Just make sure you and Miss Olson stay alert. Delaney's as dangerous as they come. Jacob spent the night at a modest hotel near the auction yards, where preparations for the upcoming sale were already underway. Army quartermasters in crisp uniforms inspected holding pens while cattle brokers discussed prices and quality in hushed, competitive tones. The stakes were clear. The army contracts would fetch premium prices, enough to save the Double H if their cattle impressed the buyers. Jacob found himself thinking not just of the ranch's survival, but of what that survival might mean now, the possibility of a future different from the solitary existence he'd resigned himself to. These thoughts followed him into sleep and colored his dreams with images of the Double H restored to its former prosperity, and Nora Olson somehow part of that renewed life. He awoke before dawn, eager to begin the journey home. The marshal had promised to follow within a day, but Jacob couldn't shake a growing sense of urgency, a need to return to the ranch and to Nora that went beyond practical concerns. The return journey seemed interminable despite Jacob pushing his horse harder than was wise. By the time the familiar outline of the Double H appeared on the horizon, late afternoon shadows were stretching across the valley. As he approached, Jacob noticed unusual activity, Thomas and Samuel moving cattle from one corral to another with practiced efficiency, while smoke rose from the chimney of the ranch house. But it was the sight of Nora directing operations from horseback, her confident gestures and the responsive actions of his men that caught his attention most forcefully. She spotted him first, raising a hand in greeting before cantering over to meet him. "You're back earlier than expected," she said, her smile warming him more than it should have. "Couldn't stay away," Jacob replied, surprised by his own candor. "How are the cattle coming along?" "See for yourself," Nora gestured toward the corral where the 10 head they'd brought from the Olson ranch stood. Even from a distance, Jacob could see the improvement. Their coats gleamed in the late sunlight, and they'd filled out noticeably in just 2 days. "Thomas's feeding regimen is working wonders," Nora explained. "And Samuel had some tricks from his Texas days that have helped too." Jacob dismounted, taking in the transformation with growing hope. "They look better than I expected." "Good enough to fetch top dollar at the auction," Nora affirmed. "Thomas thinks so too." As they walked toward the house, Jacob noticed other changes. The porch had been swept clean, the windows washed, and someone had repaired the broken step he'd been meaning to fix for months. "We had some extra time," Nora said, following his gaze. "I hope you don't mind." "Mind?" Jacob shook his head, momentarily speechless. The Double H hadn't looked this cared for since before his father's death. "It's... thank you." Inside, the transformation continued. The main room had been thoroughly cleaned, his mother's few treasures polished to a shine, and the scent of cooking filled the air instead of the usual musty emptiness. "Mrs. Winters sent some supplies with Thomas," Nora explained, a hint of uncertainty in her voice now. "I thought you wouldn't object to a proper meal after your journey." "Object?" Jacob laughed softly. "Nora, I can't remember the last time this place felt like a home, instead of just somewhere to sleep between work days." Her expression relaxed, pleasure evident in her eyes. "Good, then wash up while I finish cooking. You can tell me what the marshal said over supper." Over a meal better than any Jacob had eaten at his own table in years, he recounted his conversation with Marshal Thornton, including the promise to investigate Delaney's activities and the suspected railroad connection. "He's coming this way tomorrow," Jacob concluded, "wanted to look into the situation personally." "That's a relief," Nora said. "Father should be returning within days as well. Once he knows what's happening, he can take precautions." They fell into comfortable conversation about the cattle preparations, the upcoming auction, and the improvements Nora had observed about the Double H's operation. "You have good water resources that aren't being fully utilized," she noted. "With some strategic irrigation, you could improve your grazing yields significantly." "My father always talked about digging additional irrigation channels," Jacob admitted. "But there was never enough time or hands to do the work." "It would be worth the investment," Nora insisted, "especially after you secure the army contract." The confidence in her voice, her assumption that the Double H would survive and thrive, touched Jacob deeply. For so long he'd fought alone, carrying the weight of the ranch's uncertain future on his shoulders. Having someone share not just the burden but the belief in eventual success made that burden suddenly lighter. As they cleaned up after the meal, working together in easy companionship, Jacob found himself watching Nora, the grace of her movements, the focus in her expression as she dried each plate carefully, the occasional smile she sent his way when she caught his gaze. In just days, this remarkable woman had upended everything he thought he knew about himself and his future. The walls he'd built after his father's death, the conviction that the frontier demanded solitary strength, the belief that emotional attachments were liabilities rather than assets, all were crumbling in the face of Nora's unwavering support and the connection growing between them. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jacob found the courage to voice what had been in his thoughts since Helena. When this is over after the auction, after Delaney is dealt with, what happens next? Nora turned to look at him, the fading light gilding her profile. What do you mean? You go back to your father's ranch. I stay here and try to rebuild the Double H. We return to our separate lives. The words felt hollow as he spoke them, a future suddenly less appealing than it had seemed just days ago. Is that what you want? She asked quietly. Jacob met her gaze, finding himself unable to dissemble. No, he admitted, that's not what I want at all. The honesty cost him something, pride perhaps, or the last vestiges of the protective isolation he'd clung to for so long. But as Nora's hand found his on the porch railing, fingers intertwining with natural ease, he knew the cost was worth paying. Then perhaps, she said softly, we should consider other possibilities. The moment hung between them, fragile and perfect. Jacob found himself leaning toward her, drawn by a force as inevitable as gravity, and Nora met him halfway. Their kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent, years of loneliness and walls finally breaking down between them. When they finally parted, breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to move away. I never expected this, he whispered. Never thought I'd find someone who understood. I never expected you either, Nora replied, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. A man willing to risk everything for what matters, who sees me as a partner rather than something delicate to be protected. They stayed on the porch talking until the stars emerged, sharing hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments, the conversation flowing as naturally as a spring creek. By the time they reluctantly parted for the night, Jacob again insisting she take his room while he bunked with the hands, something fundamental had shifted between them. For the first time in years, Jacob fell asleep not with worry about the ranch's future, but with hope for what that future might hold, and who might share it with him. Dawn brought renewed purpose as final preparations began for transporting the cattle to the Helena auction. The animals looked impressive after their special feeding regimen, and Thomas expressed confidence they would fetch top prices. The army buyers know quality when they see it, he assured Jacob as they worked. These beauties will catch their eye for certain. The plan was simple. Jacob, Thomas, and Samuel would drive the cattle to Helena the following day, arriving in time for the auction the day after. Nora would remain at the Double H until their return, then they would all ride to the Olson ranch to reunite her with her father, who should have returned from his business in Butte by then. Everything was proceeding smoothly until mid-morning, when the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Jacob's hand instinctively moved toward his gun until he recognized the distinctive badge of the territorial marshal glinting in the sunlight. Marshal Thornton rode at the head of a small group that included 2 deputies and, surprisingly, an older gentleman in a well-tailored suit whose bearing suggested authority. Hartley, Thornton called in greeting as they approached. Thought I'd better make good time given what you told me. Marshal, Jacob acknowledged, then froze as Nora emerged from the barn, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock as she spotted the well-dressed man. Father, she exclaimed, hurrying forward. What are you doing here? You weren't due back for days. Gerald Olson dismounted with the agility of a much younger man, embracing his daughter warmly. Finished my business early and returned to find the ranch in an uproar about Delaney's visit and you gone to Helena, he explained. Fortunately, the marshal found me before I charged off half-cocked. Jacob studied the man who had loomed so large in local ranching circles. Gerald Olson was in his 50s, his once fair hair now silver at the temples, his face weathered but handsome. The resemblance to Nora was clear in the shape of his eyes and the determined set of his jaw. Mr. Hartley, Olson said, turning to Jacob with an appraising look, I understand I owe you a debt of gratitude for protecting my daughter and my home. No debt necessary, sir, Jacob replied, extending his hand. Your daughter did as much to protect her home as I did. I was just fortunate enough to be there when trouble came. Olson's handshake was firm, his gaze evaluative but not unkind. Nevertheless, I'm grateful. His eyes moved to the cattle in the nearby corral. I see Nora arranged the stock deal we discussed. They're looking prime. They've responded well to care, Jacob acknowledged. We're taking them to auction tomorrow. The army contract, Olson nodded. Good thinking. Marshal Thornton interrupted the exchange. Perhaps we could continue this discussion inside. I'd like to hear more details about Delaney's threats while they're fresh in everyone's minds. The group moved to the ranch house, where Nora quickly prepared coffee for the visitors. Jacob found himself acutely aware of Gerald Olson's scrutiny as the older man took in the modest surroundings of the Double H, so different from his own prosperous operation. Over the next hour, Jacob and Nora recounted their encounter with Delaney and his men in detail, including the references to railroad interests and forced sales. It confirms what we've been hearing, Thornton said grimly. Someone with railroad connections is using Delaney's gang to pressure landowners along the proposed route. They buy cheap, then sell to the railroad at a massive profit when the route is officially announced. Criminal, Olson muttered. And you say they specifically mentioned my land. Called it a limited-time offer, Nora confirmed. Said they'd take it later if you didn't sell now. Thornton's expression hardened. Sounds like they're escalating from intimidation to outright threats of force. We need to move against them before someone gets killed. You think they'll try again at my ranch? Olson asked. Almost certainly, the marshal replied. Your land is particularly valuable given its water rights and position relative to the proposed junction. Jacob listened to the discussion with growing concern, especially when Thornton outlined his plan to set a trap for Delaney's gang when they inevitably returned to the Olson ranch. We'll need a few days to position men discreetly, the marshal explained. In the meantime, Mr. Olson, it might be prudent for you and your daughter to stay elsewhere. We're not abandoning our home, Olson stated firmly, echoing his daughter's earlier sentiment in a way that made Jacob smile inwardly. Not abandoning, Thornton corrected, just giving us time to prepare, 3 days at most. Jacob found himself speaking before he'd fully considered the implications. You're welcome to stay here, sir. It's not what you're accustomed to, but it's secure and out of Delaney's likely path. Olson turned to him with surprise, then thoughtfulness. That's generous, Hartley, but what about your cattle drive to Helena? I still need to go, Jacob acknowledged. The auction represents my best chance to meet the bank's deadline, but Samuel can remain here and the marshal's men could provide additional security. Or, Nora interjected, Father could stay here with Samuel and the deputies, while I continue to Helena with Jacob and Thomas as planned. Both men turned to her with identical expressions of protective concern, causing her to lift her chin defiantly. I know more about those cattle and what they're worth than anyone except Thomas, she pointed out, and I've been preparing them for auction. It makes perfect sense for me to help represent them to the buyers. Jacob caught the evaluative look Gerald Olson gave him then, measuring, considering, and realized that the older man was weighing more than just the practical aspects of the situation. Nora's attachment to helping save the Double H and possibly to Jacob himself had not gone unnoticed by her observant father. She has a point, Olson finally said, surprising everyone. Nora has an excellent eye for livestock and a good head for negotiations. If Hartley's amenable, her presence at the auction could be advantageous. The discussion continued for some time, with the marshal providing updates on his investigation and plans for capturing Delaney. Eventually, it was agreed that Gerald would remain at the Double H under protection, while Jacob, Nora, and Thomas took the cattle to Helena, returning immediately after the auction. As the meeting broke up, Olson asked Jacob to show him the rest of the ranch. The request carried the unmistakable weight of a father's interest in a man who had grown close to his daughter, and Jacob felt a nervous tension as they walked the property together. You've done well with limited resources, Olson commented as they surveyed the south pasture. Your father would be proud. The unexpected praise caught Jacob off guard. You knew my father. Not well, Olson admitted. But we crossed paths occasionally. He was known as a man of principle, sometimes to his detriment in business matters. Jacob smiled ruefully. That sounds like him. They continued walking, the older rancher asking perceptive questions about Jacob's operation, water access, breeding programs, and future plans. It felt like an examination, but not an unkind one. Finally, Olson stopped and turned to face Jacob directly. My daughter has taken a considerable interest in your ranch, Mr. Hartley. She's been invaluable in preparing the cattle for auction, Jacob replied carefully. I think we both know her interest extends beyond livestock, Olson said dryly. Nora has always been passionate and determined, qualities that serve her well in ranching, but sometimes lead her to rush into matters of the heart with the same enthusiasm. Jacob felt his face warm, but met the older man's gaze steadily. Sir, I have nothing but respect for your daughter. She's the most remarkable woman I've ever known. She is that, Olson agreed. She's also my only child and heir to one of the largest ranches in the territory. His expression softened slightly. But more importantly, she's all I have left of her mother. Her happiness means everything to me. I understand, sir. Olson studied him for a long moment. Do you? Because from what I gather, you've spent the last 2 years isolating yourself on this ranch, convinced that the frontier leaves no room for connection or family. Yet in a matter of days, my daughter seems to have changed your mind. The observation was so accurate that Jacob couldn't deny it. She made me see things differently, he admitted, showed me that fighting alone isn't always the answer, that there can be strength in partnership. Something in Olson's expression shifted, approval perhaps, or recognition. Then you're a wiser man than I was at your age. It took losing my wife to teach me that lesson. He placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. I don't know what's developing between you and Nora, but I do know this. Any man who earns her heart had better be worthy of it. I'm trying to be, sir, Jacob said quietly. Olson nodded once, then resumed walking. Now about those irrigation channels Nora mentioned. I've had some experience with similar projects that might be useful. The conversation shifted back to ranching matters, but something fundamental had changed. Jacob realized he had just received, if not approval, then at least a chance to prove himself worthy of Nora Olson, a challenge he intended to meet. The day passed in a flurry of final preparations. By evening, everything was ready for the cattle drive to Helena. A simple supper brought everyone together around the Double H's dining table, a gathering unlike any the ranch had seen since Jacob's father was alive. As Jacob observed Nora talking animatedly with the marshal about territorial politics, her father nodding in agreement, he felt a profound shift in his perception of the Double H. For so long he'd seen it as a burden, a responsibility he carried alone. Now, filled with conversation and shared purpose, it felt like something else entirely, a home with potential for a future beyond mere survival. Later, as darkness settled over the ranch and everyone retired for the night, Nora in Jacob's room, her father in the second bedroom, the marshal and his deputies in the bunkhouse with Samuel, while Jacob and Thomas prepared bedrolls in the barn, Jacob found himself unable to sleep. He stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air, gazing up at stars that seemed somehow brighter than they had in years. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn, and there was Nora, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. Couldn't sleep either, she asked softly, coming to stand beside him. Too much on my mind, he admitted. She nodded understanding. Tomorrow changes everything, doesn't it, one way or another? It does. Jacob turned to face her fully in the moonlight. Nora, whatever happens at the auction, I want you to know these past days have meant more to me than I can express. They've meant a great deal to me too, she replied, her voice gentle in the darkness. Your father and I talked today, Jacob continued, about you, about us. Nora's eyebrows rose. Did he give you the protective father speech? Something like that, Jacob smiled. But he also helped me see something clearly. What's that? Jacob took a deep breath, gathering courage. That saving the ranch means nothing if I'm still living half a life. That I've been hiding behind work and responsibility, using the frontier as an excuse to avoid the risk of caring too deeply again. He reached for her hand, finding it warm despite the cool night. You showed me there's another way to face the challenges out here, not alone, but together. and whether the auction succeeds or fails tomorrow, I don't want to go back to the way I was before." Nora's eyes shimmered in the moonlight. "Jacob Hartley, are you saying you've fallen in love with me?" "I'm saying," he replied softly, drawing her closer, "that loving you feels like the most natural thing I've ever done, even though I tried my hardest to prevent it." Her laugh was warm against his chest as she leaned into him. "Then we're well matched, because I've fallen quite thoroughly in love with you too, despite telling myself it was foolish to lose my heart so quickly." Their kiss beneath the Montana stars felt like a promise of shared tomorrows, of partnership, of a future neither had imagined just days before. When they finally parted, Jacob kept her close, unwilling to break the connection between them. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we fight for the double H together, and after that—" "After that," Nora finished for him, "we figure out the rest. Together." Dawn broke clear and cool as final preparations for departure began. The cattle, well-rested and looking their best, were gathered in the main corral while Thomas checked the wagon one last time. Marshal Thornton and his deputies would remain at the ranch with Gerald Olson and Samuel, continuing preparations for the trap they hoped would end Delaney's threats permanently. As Jacob secured his saddle, Olson approached, extending his hand. "Good luck in Helena, Hartley. I have a feeling those cattle will serve you well." "Thank you, sir," Jacob replied, shaking the offered hand. "And thank you for entrusting Nora to accompany us." Olson's eyes crinkled with knowing amusement. "I suspect wild horses couldn't have prevented her." More seriously, he added, "Take care of each other. Delaney's reach is long, and word of valuable cattle headed to auction might draw unwanted attention." "We'll be vigilant," Jacob assured him. Nora's goodbye to her father was affectionate but brief, a tight hug and whispered words that brought a smile to the older man's face. Then she mounted her horse with practiced grace, ready for the journey ahead. The small procession set out as morning light gilded the eastern hills, Jacob and Nora in the lead, Thomas following with the cattle, the loaded wagon bringing up the rear. It would be a full day's journey to Helena, with an overnight camp before reaching the auction grounds early the following morning. The cattle moved well, their condition a testament to the care they'd received. Jacob found himself filled with cautious optimism as they traveled, the nightmare scenario of losing the double H to the bank seeming less inevitable with each passing mile. By mid-afternoon, they had made excellent progress, the cattle maintaining a steady pace that would bring them to their planned campsite well before nightfall. Jacob rode alongside Nora, their conversation flowing easily between practical matters and more personal reflections. "What will you do if the auction exceeds expectations?" she asked as they crested a hill overlooking the trail ahead. "Beyond paying the bank, I mean." Jacob considered the question seriously. "Invest in those irrigation improvements your father mentioned, rebuild the herd gradually. Make the double H sustainable for the long term." He glanced at her, adding softly, "Build a future worth sharing." The implication wasn't lost on Nora, whose smile warmed him more than the afternoon sun. "Ambitious plans." "I have good reason to be ambitious now," he replied. Their moment was interrupted by Thomas calling from behind, pointing to a cloud of dust in the distance. "Riders coming, boss. Moving fast." Jacob immediately tensed, shading his eyes to study the approaching figures. "Get the cattle off the trail," he ordered, "into that stand of cottonwoods." As they quickly moved the small herd into the shelter of the trees, Jacob counted 6 riders approaching rapidly, too many and too determined for casual travelers. "Could be Delaney's men," he said grimly to Nora, who had already drawn her revolver. "They might have heard about the cattle. Or they could be completely unrelated travelers," she pointed out, though her expression suggested she didn't believe it. "Either way, we stay out of sight until we know their intentions," Jacob decided. "Thomas, keep the cattle quiet." They dismounted, leading their horses deeper into the cottonwood grove, watching as the riders drew closer to their position. From their vantage point among the trees, Jacob could now make out details, rough-looking men, heavily armed with the unmistakable bearing of frontier outlaws. His heart sank as he recognized the massive figure leading them. "Delaney," he whispered to Nora, "and Kane's with him." "They must have scouts watching the roads," Nora surmised, "looking for targets heading to the auction." Jacob nodded grimly. We're outnumbered and outgunned. Our best hope is that they pass by without noticing us. But luck wasn't with them. As the riders approached the point where they'd left the trail, Delaney signaled a halt. Kane dismounted, examining the ground with the skill of an experienced tracker. Fresh sign, his voice carried clearly in the still afternoon. Cattle and horses turned off here not 10 minutes ago. Delaney's laugh was a rumbling sound that sent a chill through Jacob. Auction-bound, you think? Has to be, Kane replied. Small herd, maybe 10 head. Prime stock by the look of the tracks. Easy pickings, Delaney decided. Fan out and find them, they can't have gone far. The outlaws spread out, moving toward the cottonwood grove with weapons drawn. Jacob exchanged a tense look with Nora and Thomas, who had joined them. We can't outrun them with the cattle, Jacob whispered, and we can't abandon them either. We need to even the odds, Nora said determinedly. Draw them away from the herd somehow. Thomas nodded toward the wagon. I loaded extra supplies, including those blasting caps from the storage shed. Thought they might be useful for clearing that stream blockage you mentioned. Jacob's mind raced. How many? Half a dozen with fuse cord. A plan began to form, desperate but with a chance of success. If we could create a distraction on the far side of the grove, it might draw most of them away. Give us a fighting chance against whoever stays behind. I'm the fastest rider, Nora stated. I should be the one to set it off. Absolutely not, Jacob countered immediately. I won't put you at that risk. Her eyes flashed. This isn't about protection, Jacob. It's about who can do what needs to be done most effectively. I'm lighter and my horse is faster. I can set the charge and get away before they realize what's happening. She's right, boss, Thomas reluctantly admitted. And I'm the best shot of the three of us. I should stay with the cattle. Jacob wanted to argue, but the sound of approaching riders made the decision for them. Be careful, he whispered to Nora. Set it and ride hard toward that ridge. We'll meet you there after we deal with whoever stays behind. Thomas quickly retrieved the blasting caps and fuse cord from the wagon, showing Nora how to set them for maximum effect. Jacob memorized her determined expression as she mounted her horse, the plan clear between them. I love you, she whispered fiercely. Remember that. Before he could respond, she was gone, slipping through the trees toward the opposite side of the grove. Jacob and Thomas positioned themselves where they could defend the cattle while watching for Nora's signal. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited, the sounds of Delaney's men searching the woods growing closer. Then, just as one of the outlaws came into view near the cattle, a tremendous explosion rocked the far side of the grove, followed by another in quick succession. What the hell? Delaney's voice boomed. Over there. Most of you with me. Hoofbeats thundered as the majority of the gang raced toward the explosions. Jacob watched anxiously for any sign of Nora, relief washing over him as he glimpsed her racing away from the scene, her horse running flat out toward the distant ridge. Now, he whispered to Thomas as they turned their attention to the two men Delaney had left to continue searching near the cattle. The ensuing gunfight was brief but intense. Jacob wounded one outlaw with his first shot, forcing the man to retreat, while Thomas's rifle dropped the second with a clean hit to the shoulder. Both men fled, clearly deciding that the cattle weren't worth their lives. Get the herd moving, Jacob ordered Thomas. Fast as they can manage toward the ridge. I'll cover you, then catch up. Thomas didn't waste time arguing, immediately gathering the cattle and starting them moving. Jacob provided covering fire as the outlaws regrouped in the distance, too far away now for accurate shooting but clearly furious at being outmaneuvered. Once Thomas had the herd well away from danger, Jacob mounted and galloped toward the ridge where he prayed Nora was waiting safely. His heart pounded with equal measures of fear and pride, fear for her safety, pride in her courage and quick thinking. As he crested the ridge, relief flooded through him at the sight of Nora waiting exactly where they'd planned, her horse breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed. It worked, she called as he approached. They all went for the explosions. Are you and Thomas all right? The cattle. We're fine, Jacob assured her, fighting the urge to pull her from her horse into his arms. Thomas is bringing the herd. 2 of Delaney's men stayed behind, but we convinced them to reconsider their career choices. Nora's laugh was part relief, part exhilaration. I set the charges far enough apart that they'll be searching for a while, thinking they're under attack from multiple directions. Brilliant and brave, Jacob said, unable to keep the admiration from his voice. Though you nearly stopped my heart when you volunteered. Her expression softened. I meant what I said before I left, about loving you. I know, he replied, and I love you too, enough to let you risk your life because it was the right plan, even though every instinct told me to protect you instead. That, she said softly, is why we work together so well. Equal partners, even in danger. The sound of approaching cattle interrupted their moment. Thomas appeared, driving the herd at a steady pace, relief evident on his face at seeing them both safe. We should keep moving, he advised. Delaney won't give up that easily once he realizes he's been tricked. Jacob nodded. We'll push on to Helena without stopping. Better to arrive exhausted than not at all. The journey continued with renewed urgency, all three riders alert for any sign of pursuit. By nightfall, they had covered significantly more ground than planned, the cattle moving well despite the accelerated pace. When they finally spotted the lights of Helena in the distance, the relief was palpable. We made it, Nora said, her voice weary but triumphant. Jacob reached across the space between their horses to squeeze her hand. We did, together. The Helena auction grounds were bustling with activity the following morning. Cattle brokers, army quartermasters, and ranchers from across the territory gathered to examine stock and discuss prices. Jacob, Nora, and Thomas had spent the early hours ensuring their 10 head were presented to best advantage, groomed, well-fed, and positioned in a pen that caught the morning light favorably. They look magnificent, Nora observed with satisfaction. The army buyers won't find better quality anywhere here today. Jacob nodded agreement, trying to quell the nervous anticipation building in his chest. So much depended on these 10 animals, the future of the Double H, his ability to repay the Olsons' trust, perhaps even his chance at a life with Nora that extended beyond this fragile beginning. The bidding starts in an hour, Thomas reminded them. I'll stay with the cattle while you two register with the auction master. As they walked toward the auction office, Jacob felt Nora's hand slip into his, a small gesture of support that meant everything in that moment. No matter what happens today, she said quietly, remember that the Double H's value isn't measured just in cattle prices or banknotes. He squeezed her hand gratefully. I know. But I'd still rather not lose my family's legacy if I can help it. You won't, she said with such conviction that Jacob almost believed the outcome was already assured. The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and preparations. When the auctioneer finally called for the first lot, which happened to be the Double H cattle, Jacob held his breath as the bidding began. The army quartermaster showed immediate interest, as did several cattle brokers looking to fulfill military contracts. The opening bid was already higher than Jacob had dared hope, and it quickly climbed as the quality of the stock became evident to all present. Beside him, Nora gripped his arm tightly as the numbers rose. They recognize what they're seeing, she whispered excitedly. Your father's breeding program and Thomas's finishing work, it's paying off. When the hammer finally fell, the price was more than double what Jacob had calculated he needed to save the ranch. The army quartermaster approached afterward, shaking Jacob's hand vigorously. Finest cattle I've seen this season, he declared. The northern forts will be well supplied thanks to your stock, Mr. Hartley. If you have more of similar quality, we'd be interested in an ongoing arrangement. As the quartermaster moved away, Jacob stood momentarily stunned by the sudden reversal of his fortunes. Not only had he secured enough to pay off the bank note, but he now had capital to invest in the improvements the Double H desperately needed, and a potential ongoing contract that would provide stability for years to come. We did it, he said softly, turning to Nora. We actually did it. Her smile was radiant as she threw her arms around him, propriety forgotten in the joy of the moment. I told you. I knew those cattle would fetch top dollar. Their celebration was interrupted by Thomas hurrying toward them, his expression unexpectedly grave. Boss, we've got trouble, he said in a low voice. Kane's here just spotted him by the eastern entrance. Looks like he's searching the crowd. Jacob's elation instantly shifted to concern. Delaney must have guessed we were heading for the auction. Sent Kane to find us while they were still searching the woods. We need to alert the authorities, Nora said firmly. There must be law enforcement here with so many valuable cattle changing hands. I'll find someone, Thomas volunteered. You two stay out of sight. As Thomas disappeared into the crowd, Jacob guided Nora toward the relative shelter of a stock barn, his mind racing. They had the auction proceeds in bank drafts safely tucked in his vest pocket, too valuable to risk with Kane so close. We should separate, he suggested reluctantly. You stay here while I lead him away from the auction grounds. Absolutely not, Nora replied with familiar determination. We stick together. Besides, he's seen both of us. He knows we're connected to the Olson ranch. If he spots either of us alone, he'll assume the other is nearby anyway. Before Jacob could argue further, Thomas returned with a Helena deputy sheriff in tow. The lawman listened to their story with increasing concern. Marshal Thornton sent word about Delaney's gang, he confirmed. We've been watching for them, but this is the first sighting. He glanced toward the entrance where Kane had been spotted. You folks stay here. I'll gather some men and will apprehend him before he causes trouble. Be careful, Jacob warned. Kane's dangerous and he might not be alone. The deputy nodded and departed quickly. Jacob, Nora, and Thomas remained in the shelter of the barn, watching the auction grounds anxiously for any sign of trouble. Once they arrest Kane, we should leave immediately, Jacob decided. Get back to the Double H and warn the marshal that Delaney's in the area. Agreed, Nora said, though I hate to cut short our celebration. Jacob smiled despite the tension. We'll have plenty to celebrate once we're safely home. The word home hung between them, its meaning shifted from what it would have been just days ago. Now it encompassed not just the physical ranch but the promise of a shared future, a home built together. Their wait ended abruptly with the sound of shouting from the direction of the eastern entrance, followed by gunshots that sent the auction crowd scattering in panic. Jacob pulled Nora deeper into the barn as people rushed past their hiding place. What's happening? She asked, trying to see through the chaos. Can't tell, Jacob replied tensely, but gunfire means Kane didn't come quietly. Thomas, who had positioned himself near the barn door, called back to them. The deputies have him cornered by the stock pens. He's shooting back, but they've got him outnumbered. Relief washed over Jacob. With Kane captured or killed, one significant threat would be eliminated. But his relief was short-lived as Thomas's next words turned his blood cold. Wait, there's more riders coming in, 4 no, 5 of them armed. Delaney, Jacob and Nora said simultaneously. The situation had suddenly become far more dangerous. What had begun as an attempt to arrest one man was evolving into a potential shootout between law enforcement and Delaney's entire gang, with innocent auction-goers caught in the middle. We need to get out of here, Jacob decided, now while they're focused on the deputies. Our horses are on the other side of the grounds, Nora reminded him. We'd have to cross open space to reach them. Thomas gestured toward the rear of the barn. There's a back exit. I saw a supply wagon loading earlier. Might be our best chance to slip away unnoticed. It was their only viable option. The three made their way quickly through the barn, emerging cautiously into the relative quiet of the service area behind the auction grounds. As Thomas had reported, a supply wagon stood nearby, the driver anxiously watching the commotion at the main entrance. Sir, Jacob approached him directly, we need your help. Those outlaws are after us, and we need to get clear of here immediately. The man, an older fellow with a kindly face, hesitated only briefly. Climb in the back, he said. I'm headed north out of town anyway. They didn't need a second invitation. Within moments, they were concealed among crates and sacks as the wagon rumbled away from the auction grounds. Through a gap in the canvas covering, Jacob could see the chaos they'd narrowly avoided, Delaney's men exchanging fire with deputies while panicked auction-goers fled in all directions. Do you think the deputies will stop them? Nora asked softly. Maybe, Jacob replied, but Delaney's survived this long for a reason. Our best hope is to get back to the Double H and warn the marshal. The wagon driver took them as far as the northern edge of Helena before they thanked him and disembarked. From there, they walked to a livery stable where, for a premium price, they acquired 3 fresh horses for the journey back to the ranch. It'll be well after dark before we reach the Double H, Thomas calculated as they rode out. But these horses should get us there without needing to rest. Jacob nodded, acutely aware of the bank drafts secured in his vest pocket and the precious cargo riding beside him. The auction success meant nothing if they couldn't make it back safely. The journey was tense, each rider scanning the horizon frequently for signs of pursuit, but as miles accumulated behind them with no indication of Delaney's gang, they began to hope they'd truly escaped. Night had fallen by the time they approached the familiar territory of the Double H. The ranch house came into view, lamplight glowing warmly from its windows, a beacon guiding them home. As they rode into the yard, the front door opened, and Gerald Olson stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand until he recognized the approaching riders. "Thank God," he said as they dismounted. "We were beginning to worry." Marshal Thornton appeared beside him, his expression sharpening as he noted their exhausted state. "Trouble." "Delaney and his gang showed up at the auction," Jacob confirmed grimly. "Kane was captured, I think, but there was a shootout. We managed to slip away in the confusion." The marshal ushered them inside, where Samuel quickly took charge of preparing coffee and food. As they warmed themselves by the fire, Jacob and Nora recounted everything that had happened, from the ambush attempt on the trail to the chaos at the auction. "The good news," Jacob concluded, "is that the cattle brought more than double what we expected." The army quartermaster was impressed enough to suggest an ongoing arrangement. Gerald Olson's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's excellent news, Hartley. Congratulations." "We couldn't have done it without your cattle and your daughter's expertise," Jacob acknowledged. "The Double H owes you both a debt I'm not sure I can ever repay." "Oh, I think you'll find a way," Olson replied with a knowing glance between Jacob and Nora that made his meaning clear. Marshal Thornton, more concerned with the Delaney situation, interrupted their moment of celebration. "If Kane was captured, that's a significant blow to the gang, but Delaney himself is the real threat." He stood, decision made. "I'll ride for Helena at first light with my deputies. Need to coordinate with the town authorities while the trail is fresh. And we'll implement the trap we discussed," Olson added. "Delaney will be looking for revenge now, and my ranch is still his likely target." Plans were made and roles assigned for the coming days. The marshal and his men would return to Helena, while Olson would go back to his ranch with additional protection to set the trap for Delaney. Jacob, Nora, Thomas, and Samuel would remain at the Double H until word came that the danger had passed. As the evening wound down and everyone retired for the night, arrangements similar to those of nights before, Jacob found himself alone with Nora on the porch, both too wired from the day's events to sleep despite their exhaustion. "I still can't quite believe it," he said softly. "Just days ago I was certain I'd lose everything. Now you have a future," Nora finished for him, leaning against the porch railing beside him. "The Double H will thrive again." Jacob turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "That's only part of what I meant. Yes, the ranch is saved, but that seems almost secondary now." He searched for words to express the transformation he'd undergone. "I came to your father's ranch looking for cattle and found something I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that?" she asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "A partner," Jacob said simply. "Someone who sees the world as I do, who understands that this land gets into your blood, who faces challenges head-on instead of retreating from them." He drew her closer. "Someone who reminded me that the frontier doesn't have to be faced alone." Nora's smile was soft in the lamplight spilling from the window. "We make a good team." "We do," he agreed, "which is why I'm hoping." "That is, I wanted to ask," he faltered, suddenly nervous despite everything they'd faced together. Nora laughed gently. "Jacob Hartley, are you trying to propose to me? After knowing me less than a week?" "Is that too soon?" he asked uncertainly. "On the frontier," she shook her head, "I've seen marriages arranged after shorter acquaintance, but those weren't love matches." Her eyes held his steadily. "Is that what you're offering, a marriage of convenience because we work well together?" "No," Jacob replied firmly. "I'm offering a life built on both love and partnership. I know it seems fast, but when something is right, you just know it." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Nora Olson, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of that privilege." Her response was to rise on tiptoe and kiss him softly. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, I'll have you, Jacob Hartley, because I love you too, and because together we can build something wonderful here." They sealed their promise with another kiss, this one deeper and filled with the joy of a future suddenly bright with possibility. When they finally parted, Jacob rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to break the connection between them. "Your father might have something to say about this," he murmured. Nora laughed. "Father's been expecting this since the moment he saw us together. Why do you think he was so willing to let me stay here while he returns to our ranch?" "He's a perceptive man." "He is," she agreed. "And he approves, which matters to me even though I'd have chosen you regardless." Their quiet moment was interrupted by Samuel opening the front door. "Boss, sorry to disturb you, but there's a rider coming fast from the north." Jacob and Nora exchanged concerned glances before hurrying inside, where Gerald Olson and Thomas were already arming themselves. Marshal Thornton appeared from the guest room, buckling on his gun belt. "Single rider," the marshal confirmed. Samuel nodded, moving like the devils on his tail. They moved to the windows, watching as the distant figure resolved into a man on horseback, pushing his mount hard toward the ranch house. As he drew closer, Jacob recognized one of the Olson ranch hands. "It's Bill," Nora identified him, "one of our most trusted men." The rider thundered into the yard, his horse lathered and breathing heavily as he dismounted in a rush. Gerald Olson met him on the porch. "What is it, Bill?" "Delaney, sir," the man gasped out. "He hit the ranch tonight with what's left of his gang, burned the barn and 2 outbuildings before we drove them off." "Anyone hurt?" Olson demanded, his face grave. "2 hands wounded, not serious, but they took Mrs. Winters, sir, said they'd trade her for you, specifically mentioned both you and Miss Nora." The news hit like a physical blow. Mrs. Winters had been with the Olson family for years, more friend than employee, practically family. "Where?" Marshal Thornton demanded. "They said the old Blackwater mine, noon tomorrow. Come alone or they kill her." Bill looked devastated. "I'm sorry, sir. We tried to stop them, but they came out of nowhere." Olson's expression hardened. "Not your fault, Bill. You did right coming here immediately." The next hour was consumed with planning and preparation. The Blackwater mine had been abandoned years ago after a partial collapse made further excavation too dangerous. Located in rugged country east of the Olson ranch, it offered Delaney perfect terrain for an ambush. "It's obviously a trap," Thornton stated. "They have no intention of letting any of you walk away alive." "Obviously," Olson agreed grimly, "but we can't abandon Mrs. Winters." "We won't," the marshal assured him. "But we need to be smarter than they are." A plan began to take shape, one that involved significant risk but offered their best chance of rescuing Mrs. Winters and ending Delaney's threat permanently. Marshal Thornton and his deputies would circle around to approach the mine from the rear, while Olson would appear to comply with Delaney's demands, buying time for the lawmen to get into position. "I'm coming too," Nora stated firmly when her father tried to insist she remain at the Double H. "Absolutely not," Olson replied. "They specifically asked for both of us." "It's a death sentence." "Which is precisely why I should be there," Nora argued. "Delaney will be suspicious if I'm not. He knows how close Mrs. Winters and I are. He's counting on that attachment to draw us both in." Jacob, torn between protecting Nora and respecting her right to make her own choices, found himself speaking. "She's right. Delaney's no fool. If Nora doesn't appear, he'll know something's wrong." "Then what do you suggest?" Olson demanded. "That I risk my only child." "No," Jacob replied calmly, "that we adjust the plan to account for both of you being there but ensure Nora is protected." He outlined a modification, one that would use Nora's presence as a distraction but keep her out of the direct line of fire when the trap was sprung. Reluctantly, Olson agreed. The group spent the remainder of the night finalizing details and gathering supplies. By dawn, they were mounted and ready to ride, Marshal Thornton and his deputies heading out first to circle around to the mine, followed by the others who would approach more directly. As they prepared to leave, Jacob drew Nora aside for a moment of privacy. "I want you to take this," he said, pressing something into her hand. She looked down to find his mother's ring, a simple gold band with a small pearl that had been among the treasures on the mantelpiece. It was my mother's, Jacob explained softly. My father gave it to her when they claimed this land together. I want you to have it now as a promise. Nora's eyes filled with tears as she closed her fingers around the ring. A promise that we'll have our future together. Exactly, he nodded. So be careful today, follow the plan, because I intend to see that ring on your finger permanently when this is over. She slipped the ring onto her finger, then reached up to kiss him briefly but fiercely. I will if you will, partners, remember. Partners, he agreed. The ride to the Blackwater mine took most of the morning, tension building with each mile. They stopped within sight of the abandoned operation, observing from a sheltered position. The main shaft entrance was visible, along with several dilapidated outbuildings. Two men with rifles stood guard outside, but there was no sign of Delaney himself or Mrs. Winters. They'll have more men inside the mine, Thornton had warned before they separated, and probably lookouts on the surrounding ridges. We'll take care of those first, then move in behind them while you draw their attention to the front. Now as the appointed meeting time approached, Jacob, Nora, Gerald Olson, and the others prepared for their roles. According to the plan, Olson and Nora would approach openly, appearing to comply with Delaney's demands, while Jacob, Thomas, Samuel, and Bill would position themselves as hidden backup. Remember, Jacob said quietly to Nora, when the shooting starts, you get down immediately and stay down until one of us comes for you. She nodded, though the determined set of her jaw suggested she might have her own ideas if the situation demanded. The Olsen stubbornness that Jacob had come to admire could also be a source of concern in dangerous circumstances. It's time, Olsen said, checking his pocket watch. The marshal should be in position by now. Father and daughter mounted their horses, preparing for their approach to the mine. Jacob watched them go with a mixture of admiration and fear, admiration for their courage, fear for the danger they were riding toward. They'll be all right, boss, Thomas said beside him. The marshal knows what he's doing. Jacob nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't ease as he watched Nora and her father ride slowly toward the mine entrance. The guards spotted them immediately, one disappearing inside while the other kept his rifle trained on the approaching pair. Moments later, William Delaney himself emerged from the mine, dragging Mrs. Winters with him. Even from a distance, Jacob could see that the housekeeper had been roughed up, though she stood as straight as her age and circumstances allowed. Delaney's voice carried clearly in the still air. That's far enough, Olson. Dismount and come forward, both of you. Gerald and Nora complied, stopping their horses and climbing down slowly, hands visible. Jacob and the others used their distraction to edge closer, using the scattered rocks and brush for cover. Let Mrs. Winters go, Olson called. You have us now. Delaney laughed, the sound ugly in the quiet landscape. Not that simple, old man. First, we're going to have a conversation about that land of yours and how it's going to belong to me and my partners now. You mean your railroad partners, Nora spoke up boldly. The ones using you to do their dirty work. Delaney's expression darkened. Clever girl, too clever for your own good. He shoved Mrs. Winters roughly toward one of his men. Get her inside. We'll deal with these two first, then finish her later. As the henchman dragged Mrs. Winters back toward the mine entrance, a shot rang out from the ridge above, one of the marshal's men eliminating a lookout. The unexpected sound caused momentary confusion, exactly as planned. In that instant of distraction, Jacob and the others opened fire from their concealed positions, forcing Delaney and his men to dive for cover. Simultaneously, Marshal Thornton and his deputies emerged from behind the mine buildings, catching the outlaws in a crossfire. Get down, Jacob shouted to Nora, who had already dropped to the ground, pulling her father down with her. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire as Delaney's gang found themselves trapped between two forces. Two outlaws fell immediately, while others retreated into the mine shaft, dragging Mrs. Winters with them. They're using her as a shield, Thornton called out. Hold your fire. Delaney himself had taken cover behind a large boulder, returning fire with vicious accuracy that kept the marshal's men pinned down. The standoff threatened to deteriorate into a protracted siege, exactly what they couldn't afford with Mrs. Winters' life in the balance. Jacob caught Nora's eye across the open space and saw her gesture subtly toward the side of the mine, where a narrow trail led up to what appeared to be a secondary entrance. Without waiting for permission or discussion, she began crawling toward it, using the sparse vegetation as cover. Jacob immediately understood her intent and the danger it represented. Gesturing to Thomas to provide covering fire, he moved to follow her, staying low and using the ongoing gunfight as concealment for his movements. He caught up to her just as she reached the trail. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "There's another way in," she whispered back. "I remember from when Father brought me here as a child. The mine has a vertical shaft that connects to the main tunnel. We can get in behind them." "It's too dangerous," Jacob protested, though he knew from her expression that argument was futile. "Mrs. Winters is family," Nora stated simply. "I won't leave her in there while we wait for Delaney to decide to kill her." Jacob recognized the futility of trying to dissuade her. "Then we go together." "Partner." Her brief smile was all the acknowledgement needed as they made their way carefully up the narrow trail. The secondary entrance was partially collapsed but still passable, a vertical shaft with a ladder leading down into darkness. "Father had interests in this mine years ago," Nora explained as they prepared to descend. "I used to play here before the collapse. The vertical shaft connects to the main tunnel about 50 yards in." Jacob went first, testing each rung of the ancient ladder before putting his weight on it. The descent was nerve-wracking, the wood creaking ominously beneath them, but it held. At the bottom, they found themselves in a narrow side tunnel dimly lit by a shaft of sunlight from above. Moving as quietly as possible, they made their way toward where the tunnel should connect with the main shaft. The sounds of the gunfight outside were muffled but still audible, punctuated by shouted orders and threats. As they approached the junction, voices became clearer, Delaney giving instructions to his remaining men, their tones urgent and angry. Jacob and Nora paused, listening intently. "Not going to be taken alive," Delaney was saying. "When I give the signal, Bates, you take the old woman and head for the back exit. The rest of us will provide covering fire." "What about the dynamite?" another voice asked. "Set it with a long fuse, should buy us enough time to get clear before it brings the whole mine down on them if they try to follow." Jacob and Nora exchanged alarmed glances. Delaney wasn't just planning an escape, he intended to collapse the mine, potentially killing everyone inside and out if the structural damage was extensive enough. They had to act immediately. Jacob leaned close, whispering directly into Nora's ear. "I'll create a distraction. You get to Mrs. Winters if you can, but stay out of the line of fire." She nodded, her hand finding his briefly in the darkness, squeezing once before letting go. Taking a deep breath, Jacob moved to the edge of the junction, drew his revolver, and fired 2 quick shots into the main tunnel. The reports were deafening in the confined space, but achieved the desired effect. Shouts of surprise and confusion erupted from Delaney's men. "They're behind us," someone yelled. In the chaos that followed, Jacob fired again, more precisely this time, hitting one of the outlaws in the arm. Nora used the distraction to slip along the edge of the tunnel toward where Mrs. Winters was being held. The gunfight within the mine was brief but intense, bullets ricocheting dangerously off stone walls. Jacob kept moving, making himself a difficult target while drawing attention away from Nora's rescue attempt. He caught glimpses of her reaching Mrs. Winters cutting the ropes that bound the older woman's hands, then guiding her toward the side tunnel. But before they could make their escape, Delaney himself appeared, his massive form blocking their path. "Going somewhere, ladies?" he growled, raising his pistol. Jacob didn't hesitate. He charged forward, slamming into Delaney's side just as the outlaw fired. The bullet went wide, embedding itself in the tunnel wall as both men crashed to the ground. The struggle that followed was desperate and primal, Delaney's superior size and strength against Jacob's determination to protect Nora and Mrs. Winters at any cost. They grappled in the semi-darkness, each fighting for control of Delaney's pistol. "Go," Jacob shouted to Nora, "get her out now." From the corner of his eye, he saw Nora hesitate, clearly torn between helping him and getting Mrs. Winters to safety. Then her expression hardened with decision, and she urged the older woman toward the side tunnel, pausing only long enough to grab a discarded revolver from the ground. Delaney, seeing his hostage escaping, roared with rage and redoubled his efforts. He smashed his forehead into Jacob's face, the impact sending stars across his vision. In that moment of disorientation, Delaney wrenched the pistol free and aimed it at Jacob's heart. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Delaney's gun. The outlaw's eyes widened in surprise, then dulled as he slumped forward, revealing Nora standing behind him, the revolver still raised in her steady hand. "I told you," she said, her voice remarkably calm, "partners protect each other." There was no time for further discussion. The remaining outlaws were retreating deeper into the mine, and the dynamite Delaney had mentioned remained a threat. "We need to find that explosive," Jacob said urgently, getting to his feet, "and warn the marshal about the back exit." They discovered the charges already set near one of the main support beams, the fuse not yet lit. Jacob carefully removed it while Nora retrieved Mrs. Winters from where she'd taken shelter in the side tunnel. "Are you hurt?" Nora asked the housekeeper gently. "Nothing that won't heal," the older woman replied with surprising spirit. "But I'd very much like to get out of this dreadful place." With Mrs. Winters between them, they made their way back to the vertical shaft and helped her up the ladder to safety. By the time they emerged into daylight, the gunfight outside had subsided. Marshal Thornton and his deputies had captured or killed most of Delaney's gang, though a few had escaped through the back exit before they could be apprehended. The reunion between Gerald Olson and his housekeeper was touching, the normally reserved rancher embracing Mrs. Winters with genuine relief while fighting back tears. Nora joined them, the three forming a tight circle that spoke of bonds deeper than employer and employee. Marshal Thornton approached Jacob, eyeing his battered appearance with concern. "Delaney." "Dead," Jacob confirmed. "Nora saved my life." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly, but his only comment was, "Remarkable woman." "She is," Jacob agreed, his gaze finding Nora across the clearing. She looked up at that moment, their eyes meeting with a silent understanding that transcended words. They had faced death together and emerged stronger, a partnership forged in the crucible of danger and mutual trust. In that moment, Jacob knew with absolute certainty that the Double H's future and his own were irrevocably linked with Nora Olson. The frontier that had once seemed so empty and unforgiving now held the promise of a life rich with purpose and companionship. The aftermath of the confrontation at Blackwater Mine unfolded over the following weeks. Marshal Thornton's investigation revealed that Delaney had indeed been working for a consortium of railroad investors seeking to acquire land along the proposed route at below-market prices. With Delaney dead and several of his accomplices in custody, the scheme collapsed, allowing legitimate negotiations to proceed with landowners. For the Double H, the aftermath brought transformation. Jacob paid off the banknote in full, then immediately began implementing the improvements he and Nora had discussed: irrigation channels to enhance the grazing land, repairs to long-neglected buildings, and the gradual rebuilding of his cattle herd. Thomas decided to stay on as foreman, impressed by the ranch's prospects and Jacob's vision for its future. With the promised ongoing contracts from the Army quartermasters, the Double H's financial stability was assured for the foreseeable future. But the most significant change was personal rather than practical. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the mine, under a perfect Montana sky, Jacob Hartley and Nora Olson were married on the porch of the Double H Ranch house. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by both ranch households and friends from surrounding properties. Gerald Olson gave his daughter away with evident pride, while Mrs. Winters, recovered from her ordeal, dabbed at her eyes throughout the proceedings. "I give you this ring," Jacob said, placing his mother's gold band permanently on Nora's finger, "as a symbol of our partnership and my endless love." Nora's voice was clear and confident as she spoke her vows in return, promising to build a life together on the foundation of mutual respect and devotion they'd established in their short but intense courtship. The celebration afterward reflected the joining of two ranching traditions, Olson prosperity with Hartley determination. Gerald Olson surprised the couple with his wedding gift, the transfer of a significant portion of his northern grazing land to the Double H, effectively doubling its size and viability. "It's not charity," he assured Jacob when the younger man began to protest. "It's investment in my daughter's future and the legacy you'll build together. Besides," he added with a smile, "I'm not getting any younger, and someday the Olson Ranch will be Nora's anyway." Consider this an advance on her inheritance. As evening approached and guests began to depart, Jacob and Nora found a quiet moment together on the same porch where, weeks earlier, they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. "Happy, Mrs. Hartley?" Jacob asked softly, still marveling at the reality of their union. "Extremely," Nora replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I must admit, when I rode to Helena looking for my father that day, I never imagined I'd return having found a husband instead." Jacob laughed, the sound free and joyful in a way it hadn't been for years. "And when I came to your father's ranch looking for cattle, I certainly never expected to find the other half of my heart." "The most unlikely place," Nora mused, glancing around at the ranch that would now be their shared home. "Yet somehow it feels like exactly where I'm meant to be." As the sunset painted the Montana sky in brilliant hues, Jacob Hartley held his bride close, marveling at how completely his world had changed in the span of a few short weeks. The Double H, once a burden of solitary struggle, had transformed into the foundation for a future bright with possibility. The ranch that he had fought so desperately to save had, in the end, saved him, by leading him to Nora, to partnership, to a love that made the harsh frontier not just survivable, but truly worth living. Together, they watched night fall over the land that was now their shared legacy, a legacy that would grow and flourish under their combined care, just as the love between them had blossomed in the most unlikely of places and the most unexpected of times.